Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is Amy Gong, and I'm a project assistant here at the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program today. We're going to be presenting some findings from our recent report called Achieving Universal Broadband in California, written with my colleagues Joseph Hayes, Newgao, Darriya Starr. So for today, my colleague Darriya and I will be presenting some main findings and some interesting results from our report. We'll have a conversation about some key policy takeaways around Senate Bill 156. And then finally, we'd like to open it up to some audience questions and invite any kind of comments or issues that you, if you're tuned in today's events, have on your mind. And we'll go into some detail about how to send those in just a second. We'd like to acknowledge our funders for today, the Michelson 20mm Foundation and the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, for making today's event and our report possible. And so before we begin, several other housekeeping items. So the report that we are referencing today and the slides that you see on the screen right now, they're both going to be available on the website at ppic.org. PPIC is also a public charity and is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization. As a result, it does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or on any local, state, or federal legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. So like we mentioned earlier, if you do have questions for today, please feel free to email them to the event that you see on the screen right now, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And please be sure when you're writing your email into us, please be sure to put your name and your organization along with your question. We do look forward to hearing from you. And with that, I will go ahead and I will start off my portion of the presentation. I will give an overview of our report and just what our data sources looked like, and then I will pass it over to my colleague Darriya Starr, and Darriya will take you through some more findings in more detail from our report. So once again, some contextual information along with some motivation for why we decided to conduct this project. So our report falls on the heels of Senate Bill or SB 156, which was a landmark infrastructure bill, which in 2021, when it was passed in the state of California, provided over $6 billion for equitable, affordable access for Californians for high-speed internet in the form of middle mile and last mile infrastructure. When we were thinking about this report, we wanted our analysis to be three-pronged. We had three major goals with what we wanted to accomplish. The first was to characterize local efforts across the state. What were people doing in order to promote connectivity? The second is to look into a little bit more detail about the successes and the challenges in doing so, talking to individuals, locales, local governments, organizations, consortia, nonprofits, etc. And then finally, this was an interesting result, and we'll go into this in a little bit more detail in the event today, highlighting partnerships, public and private, that came out of this effort undertaken by all these individuals and organizations to promote universal broadband here in California. So to do so, to really, I think, go into the three goals of our research, we relied on a mixed methods data analysis. So for our qualitative data, we conducted 41 interviews covering over 93% of California's population in representativeness. And you can see here on the right of our screen, we put a little pin in the map of all the counties, individuals, representatives that we talked to. We talked to some chief technology officers from county offices of education, local government leaders, individuals, tribal leaders. We tried to span as large of a range as possible with our interview sample. And then to supplement the really wonderful information we got from our interviews, we also looked at data from the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC, and the California Public Utilities Commission, including award data from the CPUC from fall 2022. So taken together, right, I think it's important to kind of revisit the motivation for why we conducted this research. We find right now that existing research actually shows that the data that is out there overstates the served areas or areas that are receiving current internet access. I think one of our interviews that we did demonstrates this point really well, where one of our respondents, who is based on tribal lands in Southern California, says, well, the FCC data maps are actually in substantial error in showing our lands, right, in terms of under or unserved potential. They show our region specifically as being served by a download speed of 100 megabytes per second and an upload speed of 10 megabytes per second. But actually, that's not the case. According to this respondent, they're entirely unserved in terms of internet connectivity. Previous efforts also highlight limitations of these official maps. So in the state of Georgia, individuals implemented a pretty unique location-based methodology where they found that over 500,000 locations in the state lacked adequate broadband connection. They also found that about half of this, about 250,000 of these locations, were actually shown by the FCC as being previously served. We also highlight similarly innovative methods undertaken by some of our interview respondents in the report that we'll be talking about today, including places like Fresno Unified School District, whose internal methods showed that nearly 13,000 of their elementary and secondary students were unserved living around the city of Fresno. So with that transition, I'd like to go over and pass the mic on to my colleague Darriya Starr, who will go over some of these more interesting and really intriguing findings from our report.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for passing it over to me, Amy. I'll just start in here and pick up where Amy has left off and begin by introducing myself. I am a researcher in education policy here at the Public Policy Institute of California, and I'm going to walk you through a summary of some of our key findings and how some of the key findings from our research have led us to a few policy recommendations. So 3 major challenges we identified were infrastructure, affordability, and digital literacy. So I'm going to start off by explaining how those infrastructural challenges change and differ across the California landscape, and then progress to talking about how affordability has become a challenge and been a challenge for a long time. That has shifted even with different programs that may attempt to subsidize internet access or help in other ways, and then progress to talking about digital literacy and explaining how important that is for really ensuring that even when people have access to devices and internet, they're actually able to use them effectively for whatever they need to do throughout the day. And we'll do so with the focus on broadband access here due to its reputation for providing stability and the recent influx of funding for broadband infrastructure from SB 156 that Amy has described. And doing that, I'll just transition to the next slide that focuses on infrastructure, particularly to for rural communities. So here, essentially, some of these rural infrastructural challenges that they face are both common to some rural and urban communities, but oftentimes we found that there were differences in the challenges that these communities faced based on their location throughout the state and how populous their area is. So many rural communities that we spoke to throughout our interviews have mountainous terrains with trees and varying levels of elevation that make it infeasible to connect every household in their area, particularly with a wireless connection that requires a clear line of sight. So that means not being blocked by trees or mountains or any hills or changes in that elevation in their area that may disrupt that line of sight connection. So that's why many had hoped to bury fiber so that they wouldn't have to rely on those wireless connections that may be blocked by landscape challenges. But burying fiber, while it may seem like an alternative for these communities, it's often infeasible due to the high amount of funding required in some areas to break through high density rock. So oftentimes we heard that that requires diamond drills, even at the most high dense rock areas. So to get fiber lines buried underground, the additional funding required for that often wasn't available to many communities. And then another infrastructural challenge that these communities faced was sparse gateway infrastructure. So we might consider gateway infrastructure something like roads that are suitable for large construction trucks or maintenance trucks to be able to get up into either an area that is in this mountainous terrain or is very far out and may have a dirt road, and that may not be paved or may not be even the right width for a large work truck to get through and install that fiber and also be able to maintain it. So returning back, we also heard how the distance from many major highways was a challenge for maintaining a stable connection, because if someone goes offline or has connectivity difficulties, they lose access immediately, or their access significantly decreases in quality immediately. But to wait several hours or perhaps even days for someone to arrange for a truck to be able to get into that area would be an increased difficulty that some of these regions face. Additionally, some communities, particularly tribal communities that run on limited supply generators for their electricity, had concerns about their gateway infrastructure as well being adequate to be able to sustain internet access. So many communities had to give out charging banks to people in their individual homes if they didn't even have enough outlets in their homes to be able to charge, but also if they were not connected to a power grid so that they could basically have enough power to run their devices and their internet connection. So that's something that migrant camps also face, and in particular, migrant camps are often disconnected even when their surrounding communities have much better access. And oftentimes we do see that they aren't prioritized in the connectivity that is being done throughout the state. So we have a lot of work to do there to be able to get everyone connected. And urban communities also face challenges, which might be surprising to some people. But even within areas that have a high population density, many multi-unit residences are often disconnected or poorly connected when their surrounding communities might even be well served with internet access. So we find this happening as similar to mobile home parks in many areas. So mobile home parks often have existing utility lines that are buried so close to the surface of the streets that they're often referred to as a spaghetti of existing utility lines. So that provides two challenges. One is the danger for new installations. So it's sometimes dangerous for work staff to run into one utility line while they're trying to install fiber lines or maintain existing fiber lines. Additionally, shutting off those utility lines that are already pre-existing, that are often referred to as that spaghetti, would be difficult for these communities because they are essential to basic functioning. So having that set off, whether someone needs to install the fiber across several months or be able to maintain a line at any infrequent moment, could be very disruptive to the normal functioning of those communities. Additionally, affordability is another lens that we can look at the challenges of connecting people to internet access through. So one particular thing that transitions us from that infrastructural mindset to understanding how affordability serves as a barrier for connecting communities across the state and on the local and household levels, we might understand that initially, there were very early mapping efforts done that, while they were useful for identifying many areas that weren't served very well, they were also highly inaccurate on the very localized level. So some first round mapping has been used as a initial kind of gateway for funding and for the prioritization of funding. And having those maps be highly inaccurate and based on having even just one household be well served with a good internet connection when all of their neighbors might struggle to get access and have significantly worse access, that is something that was a barrier for many communities to be able to be prioritized in future rounds of funding that happened. So that was one challenge on the infrastructural level, getting funding for the build out of broadband that many communities faced if they were considered well served, but they actually found that with further nuanced data, they had much greater difficulties with being connected to the internet, and many more people needed access than they originally thought from those maps. So natural disasters throughout California of many types, high winds, fires, and earthquakes are also another challenge that many communities have faced. And it creates both instability in those lines and a difficulty when they're trying to rebuild after a disaster. So the challenge for many communities here is that many power lines often hold lines of fiber that are above ground, so that internet can be provided to their communities along easy existing utility lines. And if that fiber isn't buried, then it might be up on those power lines that could get taken down during a natural disaster. And it's often too expensive and time consuming for many communities to be able to rebuild if an area that frequently suffers from natural disasters is having their power lines with those fiber lines taken down. So that both affects their gateway infrastructure to have electricity disrupted, but also to have their direct fiber lines and that connection to the internet taken offline, and having to struggle to rebuild and also go through processes of reapplying for different funding to rebuild that infrastructural baseline to get people back online. Additionally, fiber that is buried underground may be disrupted by natural disasters like earthquakes throughout California, particularly in areas that have major fault lines. So that is very difficult for many communities to not have the option to do either without worrying about that concern sometimes of above ground and below ground fiber having challenges there and risks there. So many low-income households and also people residing in areas with high costs of living also face barriers. So these affordability barriers have been helped over time by programs like the Affordable Connectivity Program, which helps households who can't afford to pay the market rate for internet with a $30 per month subsidy. So they're able to get that through an internet service provider that they may already be using and may be struggling to afford that bill every month, or sign up if they don't already have access. So enrollment in the ACP is one thing that has been a particular challenge over the whole life of the program, and even the predecessor to that program, the EBB, the Emergency Broadband Benefit. And in California, 5.8 million Californian households are eligible for the ACP, which translates to about 45% of California's population that could be taking advantage of the subsidy. Unfortunately, enrollment has currently only grown to 32% instead of up to that 100% of eligible households that we could get to. So lack of awareness is one particular problem with the Affordable Connectivity Program. Many people, especially early on, even when the program was transitioning from the EBB, the Emergency Broadband Benefit, didn't know that the program existed or could help them. So knowing that they're both aware of the program and knowing that they are eligible for the program are two challenges within that lack of awareness. And then once people do know that the program exists, going through that application process can often be a difficulty for many individuals, because it does take time for busy families, households, working individuals, and even people with disabilities being able to get the proper support to go through the application process is another thing that may be a barrier to many people for signing up. And the application process we have heard, it's not often clear at the beginning what steps people will need to take to apply, and all of the processes throughout that. And additionally, there's a verification element to the application that requires people to get external verification that they do qualify for the program, usually income-based, and being able to do that requires an extra step in coordination with some exterior organization, like even a family's school that their child attends or another program that they're enrolled in, to get verification that they do qualify based on their income. And that eligibility verification process can be another step where families might drop out of applying and not actually get to the final stage where they receive internet access. Additionally, not every internet service provider offers that subsidy through the ACP. So if someone has internet access that they're struggling to afford through the ACP, or has an internet service provider in their area that provides a stronger connection than the ACP participating providers, they wouldn't actually be able to receive that subsidy unless they used one of the participating providers. So that's one additional barrier that households face when they're trying to navigate the cost of internet and be able to afford that internet access, even when subsidy programs like this exist. Additionally, digital literacy is one element that's often forgotten about in the discussion for connecting people to internet access, but it's important that people understand how to use devices, how to connect to their network, and also how to use any accompanying technological skills that have come along with providing and being able to use the internet access that people will be connected to. So once people are connected, they really need to be able to have the skills and the familiarity with technology to be able to take advantage of all of the opportunities that it could provide them. And many people do lack that existing familiarity with digital tools and devices throughout California. And not everyone has information, prior training, and resources to obtain particular classes to become trained in those digital skills. So training sessions are often offered through some community anchor institutions like libraries, schools, and even hospitals, particularly for people trying to access telehealth, job searches, and education resources online. However, these sessions are infrequently offered and are often scarce or entirely absent from many communities throughout the state. So although many of these sessions do help to provide a lot of very useful skills, they're often foundational and one-time events rather than more continuous resources that may provide more of an in-depth knowledge of key information, like how to keep one's data safe online from cybersecurity risks isn't often covered, but has even received a lot of recent news attention on the personal level and on the organizational level, the risks of cybersecurity. So it's important when connecting people to the internet that they're prepared to be able to protect their own information and keep it safe and navigate the internet in a way that's both beneficial to them, but also safe. And additionally, time constraints are something that affects many populations like working adults and working parents that may find it hard to attend these sessions throughout the day or bring their children to them, or even have time to assist other family members who may be less familiar with using technology to be able to pass on their own digital literacy skills and knowledge to another person. So those time constraints kind of help divide who has access into digital literacy resources in communities throughout the state, and also outline some of the ways that these different programs can be improved, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. So here, several strategies that may bridge the digital divide. These are a few that we've come up with based on our research that it's basically our findings have led us to these since we learned that many infrastructural, affordability, and digital literacy challenges have some interlocking ways that may help communities be able to get their individuals online. And starting off with the infrastructural side, and understanding that many of these points do overlap and can be useful amongst the three categories. We learned that participating in a local consortium is definitely something that many local governments found that they could rely on as a source for information and a place to share ideas and effective strategies, or even what didn't work as well and how to avoid those pitfalls within their own communities and within their own regions. So oftentimes those would take place as a gathering of local representatives, often who shared some general access characteristic like being in the same region and facing perhaps similar rural challenges, or perhaps facing another challenge of being able to provide access to a shared characteristic in their community. So those were some of the reasons why organizations and local jurisdictions wanted to participate in a local consortium that could focus on providing guidance for how to get infrastructural build outs, and anything even related to how to participate in the ACP more. And that's something that we've heard has been very useful for brainstorming local strategies to be able to provide some guidance around those infrastructural and affordability challenges, really. And then for strategies on affordability, boosting program awareness and trust helps to defray community members' concerns around issues ranging from personal privacy of their information, if they provide it to assistive programs who might want to help them get online or get an improvement to their internet access or even receive a subsidy for it. And that can range from those personal privacy concerns to even a fear of deportation for some with mixed status families or who are undocumented. And if they provide those details to programs like the ACP, there's definitely a barrier of program trust that is an additional layer, in addition to being aware of the program and going through the application process. So also increasing the clarity and ease of the application process is something that could significantly help both for internet subsidies like the ACP, but also for local governments, schools, and other institutions that are hoping to apply for funding to build out their infrastructure. And then widening offerings through internet service providers could also help many Californians get online and benefit from all of the digital tools that the internet enables. So just to remind everyone, internet service providers take many forms, including large and small companies, as well as publicly run networks, often known as municipal networks, or networks provided through communities' anchor institutions like schools, colleges, and libraries. Additionally, mentioning anchor institutions leads us to our last two strategies here in a little bit more depth. So partnering with anchor institutions like those to educate people about their surrounding communities' resources is one strategy that many people found was effective because it provides an easily accessible and trusted point of access for community members to increase their digital literacy. So that familiarity with those existing institutions provides an easy outlet for being able to access internet resources. And then also adding a digital navigator role to many communities also helped because that person could serve as a guide to connect people with digital literacy resources, whether those were in those anchor institutions in the community or beyond, and encourage them to explore those additional resources that might be unique to their situation. So specialized support could even be provided one-to-one on an as-needed basis. And that support was often offered in between things like one-time digital literacy events. So that's something that many communities often needed or wanted some way to provide. And these digital navigator roles were able to actually serve as access points to get some guidance in between those one-time sessions, like a workshop on how to use the internet or how to apply to the ACP. Through this research, we've identified several instances where anchor institutions and digital navigators have helped people access services like telehealth, education, job applications, and remote work. So now that you've heard these strategies, I'm going to give everyone a moment to ask their questions via the email address here on the screen. And that is ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And as you all take a moment to send in those questions, I'll invite Amy back on screen to join me.
Thanks, Darriya. It's always wonderful, I think, in the kind of preparation of the report. It's a pretty dense report, and we've had a lot of really, really interesting findings. But hearing you kind of go back over it again and show the kind of breadth and depth of these results is always interesting.
Great. Thank you so much for presenting that first half, Amy. And I'd just like to ask you, which of these findings from the report are most intriguing or surprising to you?
I every single time I think I go back to the report and I think about there's a lot of different kinds of things that I think we discovered in this process. But at the very beginning of your portion of the presentation, you were talking about the different kinds of topographical concerns that residents of different parts of California faced in their journey to be able to build or kind of promote infrastructure that leads to this mission of universal broadband. We mentioned mountainous regions, we mentioned forest, sand, altitude, winds. And I think it's two things. It shows the kind of geographical variation across the state of California to begin with, but then also shows how important it is for policymakers and for individuals when considering this idea of universal connectivity, to consider the unique variations in terms of local conditions, I think, that make these specific steps possible. And I think this is a great kind of transition. We actually just received an audience question about the kind of universality of public broadband. So I just want to go ahead and put this question to you, Darriya. We have a question from Leslie Smith, who says, I see wealthy communities opting for instances of public broadband, which often produce lower costs and more reliability in terms of internet access. So what does this research show about the feasibility of public broadband and the option of public broadband in general?
That's a great question. So public broadband in general has a few challenges, but has been shown to work in many communities. So it's really something that has to work for that particular community. And a few particular challenges include the cost of the infrastructural build out. So if that area is able to ensure that they can get the funding for being able to build that network, whether it be through the traditional fiber lines or an alternative, usually a wireless method. We've even heard many communities have explored satellite internet options, but depending on whether that anchor institution that's applying for it wants things like being able to censor what's going through the network or being able to kind of restrict network traffic, and also the reliability and the location throughout the state, as we explained, provide different challenges for that infrastructural build out. And then also thinking about the ongoing maintenance and upkeep of the network is another challenge. So having the additional staff, having their time, and also the cost of having additional people maintaining the network are often barriers that many people are throughout many communities have found served as huge challenges when trying to gain some sort of municipal network for their area. So that's something that we've really seen over time, and it's been important to understand whether or not it works for a particular community when you take into account all of those things. So that's such a great question, and I'm glad you asked it, Amy. To go in here to another question, we have one that says, what regional coalitions may exist to provide solutions to connectivity for those in rural communities? Existing resources?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And one of the, I think, highlights of this report is also for us when we were, as researchers, looking at local organizations that existed. We talked to one regional consortium in particular representing rural counties, RCRC, um, which I think was a really, really wonderful example. Representatives from RCRC, I think, were really wonderful about thinking about the individual needs of rural counties and rural locations in terms of promoting universal broadband. We have actually in our technical appendix on our report a full list of our interviewees, which included representatives from different and varied consortia across the state. RCRC is only just one example of, I think, one of these really wonderful success stories. But I think as we look forward, and I think this is what you mentioned too, Darriya, towards SB 156 implementation, the role of these local consortia, especially in rural regions in the state, are going to become more and more important. And to follow off of that, so we have another question from Jarrett Barrios from LA. And they write, one disappointing aspect of the SB 156 implementation has been the middle mile built out, led by SENEC and the California Department of Technology. So these agencies have shown a preference for leasing fiber in dense urban areas and citing questions of cost, which often leaves Black and Brown communities with insufficient bandwidth and less opportunities to connect. So our audience member would like to know, what are some ways that we can comment on how these agencies are performing and increase representation as we continue to look forward towards universal broadband?
I think it's important to understand when taking into account just what two agencies are doing throughout California, that getting everyone online is really a group effort. So it requires participation from everyone. And we heard that many things, whether it's creating your own municipal network or doing a partnership with public-private sector, those are all strategies that really work to connect communities throughout the different points of access that you can use to get someone online. So rather than just thinking about what two different agencies are doing throughout communities, which is certainly important and should never be discounted, we should all take into account the fact that there are many actors in the broadband space and in the internet access space overall. So understanding that and taking into account what everyone is doing, both private companies and then some of the publicly geared internet service providers, end to end is really something that we need to see most to get communities, particularly those with the least access, connected. So that's an area that we really need to focus on, thinking about that end-to-end process. And middle mile and leasing fiber and the costs of that has definitely been an extreme challenge for many communities. That's why some have explored things like dark fiber that aren't necessarily considered owned by anyone, but may provide an alternative to the traditional private fiber leasing costs. So that's not available in every area because infrastructural buildouts have happened differently throughout the state. But being able to offer some of those different resources and look into different strategies, if one thing isn't working, being able to try a different strategy, try partnerships with someone else, that is really something to take into account, thinking about that end-to-end process. So I think we have time for just one last question here. For you, Amy, someone asks, of the 41 interviews conducted, it does not appear broadband providers were included in that internet interview pool. Is that a correct observation?
That's a very astute observation. So thank you for going through our technical appendix. And again, we encourage all of you to do that because I think it gives a broader picture of who we talk to. So from a research perspective, we really centered, we first looked into interviewing chief technology officers at county offices of education and expanded outwards towards other individuals. Even though internet service providers and broadband providers are not included in this original 41, this pool of 41 interviewees, the role of ISPs and the role of broadband providers in making this happen is not something that should be undermined, I think, as we look forward towards this goal of universal broadband. And in our report, I think you can also see some really, really wonderful examples of partnerships that our interviewees were able to strike with local ISPs or larger ISPs in order for this build out to be able to happen. And I think as we look forward to the implementation and the rollout of SB 156, inclusion and I think addition of ISPs and ISP representatives into this conversation, as well as more focus towards these public-private partnerships is going to be very, very necessary. And I think almost instrumental if we are to make this happen.
Absolutely. And I'd just only like to add to that that one research project can't cover everything that we'd hope to cover. And there will certainly be many people who will follow up on these topics in the future, hopefully us too, which we're planning to. So I'd just like to thank you, Amy, for helping me present some of our findings today. And then also like to thank our funders, the Michelson 2020 Foundation, and then also the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. So thank you to everyone who has watched today and contributed questions. You'll receive a quick survey to the email that you RSVP'd to this event through. And then that concludes the time that we have for this presentation. And then have a good morning, everyone. And thank you for watching.